This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Starting today's show is University of Nebraska-Lincoln livestock economist Elliott Dennis with a cattle market update. He discusses how retail has changed for beef and turkey. K-State's Nat Bascom and guest Alemu Tirfessa from Ethiopia continue the show to talk about their international work on sorghum. Information about how people can increase acorn production from K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts rounds out today's show. He explains research that tells what deer hunters can do to increase acorn production for the wildlife. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned into Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with a cattle market update. And this week, we're joined by livestock economist from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, Elliott Dennis. Elliott, thanks for joining us this week.
Yeah, thanks for having me again, Shelby.
Elliott, kicking off our conversation, talking about retail pricing.
Yeah, retail prices have really been kind of a mixed bag this year. When we talk about where the hog market has been, we talk about the cattle, really kind of two different stories there. When we talk about, all fresh beef, we have continued to rise. And this is something that I've been a little bit surprised about. I thought we would start to see consumers pull back a little bit on what they're willing to pay, but there is still a strong demand for beef out there. And we're talking about retail ground beef prices being in, the $6 range. I didn't think we'd go that high. I didn't think consumers would continue to pay that much, but we have. And we've even seen historical spreads between what we call the lean 50s and the lean 90s. And so at least from the ground beef side, we've continued to see strong demand, even stronger than, say, like pork chops and other ground products like ground pork. So still strong, really strong there. And that has some pretty strong implications when we talk about where we're thinking about for total demand building. And so when we talk about demand, we have to think about price and quantity. And so sometimes you'll hear about per capita consumption as demand. That's not correct. And so we really want to look at what's that interaction between how much meat we're going to consume and what's that price people are willing to pay. And over the last, 20 years, 25 years, we've really seen, I'd call 3 different segments of demand growth. Really from about 1997 to about 2007, we were eating a lot of beef, but we weren't paying very much. We weren't willing to pay very much for it. And so that kind of clustered there. Then from about 2007 to about 2012, we really transitioned. People started eating a little less beef, but they were slowly starting to pay more per pound. And then over the last, we've kind of seesawed back and forth of we stopped eating less, but we were willing to pay more. And that happened from about 2011 to 2015. And then once 2015 happened, we kind of just, really kind of seesawed back, and we were paying more and we were eating more beef. And so that was why we've seen a lot of, I'd say, higher prices than we would probably have expected. But now we're kind of in a transition phase again. And so now we're trying to determine if we're going to eat a little less beef, are we going to continue to pay higher prices for that? And the Livestock Marketing Information Center is a group of livestock economists throughout the United States, and we provide input to a central team to help develop forecasts. And what I think is interesting is kind of we can get some perspective on all those inputs together and where they're forecasting that out. For 2024, they're forecasting that we'll eat about 55 pounds per person per year, so 55 pounds per capita in 2024 and about 57 this year, right? So what that's saying is that they're forecasting that we're going to eat less meat going forward, both this year and last year. So the question is, where is that going to go? Are we going to go higher? If we eat a little bit less, but we have higher prices, then we'd say there's still demand growth there. I think most likely we're going to, at least at some point, maybe not this year, I think in 2024, we might tap out. And what that ultimately means is that if people are willing to pay less at retail, that really puts kind of a cap on what packers are willing to pay for meat, what feedlots are willing to pay for feeder cattle. I don't think we're obviously not there yet, but it's something to, when we talk about kind of what's happened over the last 4 to 6 weeks with the cattle markets really collapsing, $20 a hundredweight of lost value. I think since the last time we talked, Shelby, and how quickly that turned and what was kind of driving that, about too much supply on the market, and some concerns about maybe we're not killing as much. Those markets can really change, and what looked like a really bullish market, we're trying to figure out what does that path look like over the next 3 to 4 months to try to build that 196 value that we saw in September of this year to be available for June or on the April contract again by the time we get to April. So what does that path look like for us?
And Elliott, while we're thinking kind of about demand, Thanksgiving is this week, and so turkey, while it might not be beef cattle, still something impacting the market.
Yes, and turkey is very seasonal, and the only reason that we really started talking about it was highly pathogenic avian influenza, or HPATH, or high path, you might have heard it called. And really what that was doing is it basically came through and swept through the United States and caused mass depopulation of birds, particularly here in Nebraska and in Iowa for the layer industry. And then for the turkey industry, it was mainly in South Dakota and Minnesota. Well, when you're all of a sudden depopulating lots of birds, right, there's not enough supply out there. And so how do we ration that? Well, we raise prices. And so really through 2022, we started to see those turkey prices rise. And the average whole hen, 8 to 16 pound, that's like your typical bird that a person would buy, was averaging about $1.75 per pound. And that doesn't seem like a lot when we talk about per pound of beef or pork, but compared to the 5-year average, there was about 95 cents on average over the previous 5 years. So from 2017 to 2021. So it was a lot cheaper 5 years ago. And we started out this year at pretty much at 175, and then we've been able to rebuild, the flocks, and we're below our 5-year average. And so prices have really come down dramatically. What does it ultimately mean for you? We're all consumers. Most of us are producers. And so when we think about what does it cost us to have that Thanksgiving dinner, and American Farm Bureau releases their report every year about what does it cost for a family of 10 to sit down and have dinner. And this year it's averaging about $61 for those, or $6 a person. That is lower than last year's. They were at $64. But still higher than what we saw in 2021. It was $53. And so good news is prices have started to come down. Thanksgiving may be a little bit cheaper, but definitely not as cheap as we've seen it in the past.
And Elliott, kind of transitioning now back towards the cattle market, a report that will be coming out just shortly after we get done talking here today, feedlot inventories.
I think when we talk about some of that erosion that's happened in the futures market, for sure, has really been kind of where those inventories numbers have been at. And there's been a lot of commentary on that. And the real focus was, what is those number of cattle that are on feed more than 120 days? So these are cattle that were really heavy, that hadn't been marketed. And so what would those reactions be? And so what we're kind of anticipating is that we're going to have more cattle on feed again as we start to fill up pens. We're going to see a lot of cattle placed in October, and I think there's going to be mixed results on, where we're at on total animals that are marketed. So for Nebraska, when we're thinking about where we're at, I think we're going to be somewhere in the basically more than we were at on inventories in 2023 at that same time in November. We're going to have a lot more placements, and we're going to have sold a lot more animals. And that really has to do with, we talk about differences in cattle feeding areas. It really has to do with the weights that we place at. So, and that has changed quite a bit for us. To give you an example, in October last year, about 50% of all the cattle that Nebraska placed was below 700 pounds. So total number of cattle placed in Nebraska was below 700 pounds. That is extremely abnormal. And the reason why is we tend to feed a lot of yearlings. We tend to place a lot of those in feed yards. This year, we think about that same weight class, less than 700 pounds, that only represents 25% of our placements. So we have had a dramatic shift back to where we were at. And when we think about that middle range that's kind of Nebraska sweet spot, that 700 to 900 pound, we were at basically 35 a year ago, This year, we're at about 56, 57% again. So been a big shift, and I think that has a lot to do with the number of cattle that are coming on the market, at least from Nebraska's region, and kind of what that looks like for carryover really from month to month for us.
And Elliott, as we round out today's conversation, sharing some information about heifer and bred cow values.
Yes, it's obviously fall. Steers are really kind of going to market. The real question is how many of those heifers are going to be retained. Really the story that as we've started to watch those prices is where you're at and selling those heifers really matters. And it has to do with drought. It has to do with that local demand and people's desire to rebuild herds in those areas. So you have some places, particularly here in the Northern Plains, where we are consistently selling basically heifers and cows that are $3,000 per head. You have some that are, struggling to get $2,000. And so knowing that value, knowing why that market's out there and what you can get paid for is really important. And also if you're going to be buying those, how much you can actually pay for them. And there's a lot of great tools that are out there that can help you determine the value of that bred heifer or that cow, and just kind of understanding kind of where those markets are at and where we should expect those prices to be. Definitely need to make those business decisions and just recognize that there's a lot of variability in the market right now.
Elliott, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and give us our cattle market update.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
That was University of Nebraska-Lincoln livestock economist Elliott Dennis. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our show now discussing more about the global collaboration on sorghum and millet. And to talk about it, we're joined by the Director of Engagement for the Global Collaboration on Sorghum and Millet, Nat Bascom. And Nat, today you brought a special guest along with you.
Yeah, thanks so much. If you're like me, we've probably all had a cup of coffee, or many of us have had a cup of coffee this morning. The origin of coffee is Ethiopia, and sorghum is also found and originates from Ethiopia. And so one of the great experiences and collaborations that I've enjoyed over the last 10, 15 years has been collaborating with our national partners in Ethiopia, where sorghum originates from, and from which we have been able to build our domestic sorghum breeding program for the United States. So it's a great pleasure to have Dr. Alemu Tirfessa here from Ethiopia. He works with the Ethiopian Institute of Agricultural Research, which would be the USDA equivalent in Ethiopia, and he is specifically the national director for the entire sorghum program in Ethiopia, which has about a 50-year history in that country. So we collaborate very closely with our colleagues, and particularly Alemu in Ethiopia, both in Ethiopia and across other parts of Africa. So I'm going to hand the mic over, but Alemu, it's great to have you here in Kansas, and particularly here in Manhattan at Kansas State University, and appreciate, again, the partnership through the years with Ethiopia and particularly the national program around sorghum.
Thank you so much, Nat, and thank you very much for having me. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, and we have had a very strong collaboration with K-State over the last 10 years on sorghum and millet research and development. So one of a very successful collaboration we have in terms of technology transfer, capacity building in our institute.
Alemu, how many parental lines or land races of sorghum are found in Ethiopia?
As you've mentioned earlier, sorghum is basically originated in Ethiopia, and there are a lot of diverse sorghum germplasm, close to 10,000 germplasm, that can adapt to various environments from low elevation to high elevation.
You guys mentioned collaboration and something you guys have been doing for years. However, just recently this past year kind of kickstarted a new project.
Yeah. In terms of our collaboration over the last 10 years, we were working very closely in Ethiopia around the exploration of some of that genetic material that Alemu mentioned, to where we were able to build out of that 10,000 he mentioned into what we would call a core collection, which has all the mapping of the genes and trying to understand what drives what in terms of the kind of traits you need in a traditional breeding program. So that resource is there. And then we're now working together in Madagascar, where there's a real situation in terms of food security, but also climate change and climate adaptation, in which the national government and other partners there really are looking for alternatives to maize or corn, and sorghum really has potential there. So we've been doing some assessment work, and now the Ethiopia team is actually backstopping and providing training and actual transfer of improved varieties and hybrid sorghums to Madagascar for what we call initial adaptation studies to see what could work quickly in Madagascar vis-a-vis food security for household consumption, but also for feed for ruminants, and particularly the poultry industry is interested for feed for the poultry industry. So, yeah, Alemu has been with me several times to Madagascar, and we just had a team of 8 from Madagascar in Ethiopia together with Alemu about 3 weeks ago.
So as I mentioned, the Ethiopian sorghum research program has a rich experience in the region. I can say one of the strongest breeding program in Eastern and Southern Africa. So it would really have a very good opportunity for the Madagascar team to share those experience on how really those national programs can really do research on sorghum and share germplasm, share the technical expertise from what we have. And we do have also similar agroecologists with Ethiopia. So germplasms that are working in Ethiopia could have a potential adaptation to the Madagascar situation. So it was wonderful to interact with those team to share our expertise and experience.
And just to be clear, all our funding currently is for this project in Madagascar is from the U.S. Agency for International Development. So we're working with funding from that federal fund, and we're also partnering quite closely with the Peanut Innovation Lab in the University of Georgia. So we're trying to look at sorghum, pearl millet, and groundnuts or peanuts, all in a kind of sustainable ag kind of context in Madagascar.
And Alemu, what kind of do you see as this being the impact as Ethiopia is home to sorghum?
Well, I think it's a very good opportunity to, like, for example, one of the, as Nat mentioned, that one of the collaborations through K-State, through the support of USAID, is to develop disease resistance. The matter explores existing germplasm, and one of the output of that is the development of disease-resistant genes from these land races. So that is one area where you can explore other biotic and abiotic stresses like drought, which is one of the very important in Ethiopia and around the world with the changing climate. So that will give us an opportunity to explore those germplasms that can fit into changing climate.
And what are you both excited for as you continue this collaboration with K-State and Ethiopia and Madagascar and all just working together?
I think on my side, it's just a great example of a truly global and what we would also call Pan-Africa collaboration, in which we synergize with our domestic program, all the expertise here. We've even had Brent Bean from the Sorghum Checkoff, chief agronomist, in country with us on some of our initial assessments. So it's leveraging our domestic and our international partners, and in this case, particularly the Ethiopia team. But we've shared germplasm or improved seed from Senegal, from Burkina Faso, all within this network. So the Malagasy team are really wonderful to work with. They're excited, and this is a big priority for the government. The government wants to quadruple the production area of sorghum in the next 5 years in Madagascar. So it's really big collaboration, but it's really linked to truly food security, and we hope big economic benefits in the country too when you link it to market demand on the feed side and food side.
And Alemu, what are you excited for?
Collaboration like K-State University, big university, a lot of areas that we can benefit from that. One is the expertise. Here, the technology K-State have, like high throughput facilities, advanced science that can be shared to our program, which is very, very helpful for us. So it's really interesting to continue working with the K-State. And this has been one of the culture of the Ethiopia and the U.S. universities, which has been there for more than 50 years. So it's really one of those in capacity building as well, trained here for master's, PhD, and other universities really has been a tremendous impact in our institute.
As we wrap up today's conversation, what is the next step in this collaboration?
Well, we have a lot of hard work to do on ground. It's planting season right now. The national team is in four-wheel drives getting out to some really remote sites, 6 different agroecologies in Madagascar, and we have 10 new master-level students. So this is all just essential work to try to do these initial adaptation studies. And again, we're backstopping from here and Alemu and his team. So I'm looking forward to, in February, March, when we get back in country and we start looking at yield rates, response to disease, rainfall. There's going to be some surprises. I think both good and I wouldn't say bad. You just learn. And this is really getting started on a long-term sorghum breeding program in Madagascar, and we hope to launch a platform in August and work towards a national plan. So this is like really not only quick wins, we hope right now for local farmers there and mechanized farmers, but we're trying to build really long-term sustainably and help the national team, our Malagasy colleagues, to take on the future. Yeah, it's great.
Similar to what Nat said, it is. We do have new projects that we continue to collaborate with K-State in gene discovery for some of the major threats like drought, which is very common to around here in Kansas and as well as in Ethiopia and other African countries. So that will give us another step that will further strengthen our collaboration and benefit our program and as well as K-State.
Alemu, Nat, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today and share with us some information about this global collaboration on sorghum and millet.
Thank you. Always a pleasure. Thank you.
That was Director of Engagement for the Global Collaboration on Sorghum and Millet, Nat Bascom, and he was joined by the National Coordinator at the Ethiopian National Sorghum Improvement Program for the Ethiopian Institute of Agricultural Research, Alemu Tirfessa. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday show with K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. Drew, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Shelby.
Drew, a lot of different things happening right now. Deer are in rut. It's archery season for them, and acorns are falling off of oak trees. And why is all this important for deer hunters?
So oaks are a very important species, especially in the eastern half of Kansas, for producing lots of really good browse for deer, and they also produce acorns, which the deer and many, many other species of wildlife eat. So if we're thinking about acorn production, one of the important things to think about is that white oaks are a important group of oaks for producing acorns that are low in tannin and really high in energy content. And the species that we're specifically thinking about that are white oaks are going to be our bur oak, our chinkapin, a species that's actually called the white oak, and then the swamp white oak, and then the post oak.
And Drew, you mentioned energy, so what nutrients are acorns providing for deer?
So energy is the most important thing that the acorns that oaks are producing is providing. And the way to think about acorns is not that they're going to help with antler growth, that they're going to help with producing milk and those sorts of things. So they are providing fat and carbohydrates that the deer especially need during the fall, because since rut's going on, like you mentioned, bucks are chasing does all over the country and they're burning lots of energy, and that quick source of energy is important for them right now.
Then thinking about how acorn production could be increased, some research published in 2019 looked at some different methods.
One of the things that got this group of researchers interested in doing this project is that sometimes consultants and marketing groups that are trying to sell products and that sort of thing make claims about fertilizing oak trees to increase acorn production and also to try and make the acorn sweeter. So those are two things that are often touted, and they wanted to test whether or not that was actually something that happens. And so to do that, they did a 10-year study, and they selected 120 white oak trees on a specific property, and they measured the pre-treatment acorn production for all those trees for 5 years. And then some of the trees they did nothing to. Some of them they did what we would call a crown release, where they kill the trees surrounding one of these oak trees in order to allow more sunlight to hit the crown, and then also to allow the crown to get bigger, because acorns are produced on the tips of the branches. So the bigger the crown is, the more acorns can be produced. They also fertilized some of the oak trees, and they did a combination of that crown release treatment and fertilization on some of the oak trees.
From those 5 years between the fertilizer and the crown release, what was found?
The fertilization treatment did nothing to improve acorn production. They didn't see more acorns. They didn't see big differences in nutrient content. They did see a little bit of a bump in crude protein in the acorns, but it wasn't enough that animals ate the acorns from the fertilized trees more than they did the other ones, so they didn't think it made them taste better. They also did not see that crown release and fertilization together as a treatment increased acorn production. But what they did see was that crown release by itself increased acorn production. And so that is a treatment that, folks are wanting to produce more acorns on their property, doing some crown release, thinning that timber around important trees can be good.
And how might they decide which tree they want to keep?
The way I would go about doing that is to do a acorn survey. So for several years, you wouldn't want to just do this 1 year, because we see bumper crop years with white oak trees where we might have a whole bunch 1 year and then we see almost none the next year. So you would want to have several years of data on this. But we're going to go out to our timber stand and we're going to select a smaller area timber, and we're going to go to each of those oak trees with our binoculars. We're going to look at, let's say, a 10 square foot area in each of those oak trees and count the number of acorns per branch or per unit area that oak trees have. By doing that across several years, you can figure out which oak trees are high producers and which are poor producers, because in this study, they found that 39% of the oak trees produce 69% of the acorns. So we want to find those good producing trees and then do the crown release around those good producing trees so that they can produce even more acorns.
That was K-State Wildlife Specialist Drew Ricketts. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.